It's like walking into a party with a telescope strapped to your face. Everyone's laughing, drinking, talking about nothing in particular, and you're standing in the corner staring into galaxies no one else even knows are there. You try to point them out, no one sees them. You lower the telescope, smile, nod, pretend you're looking at the same things. Most people don't talk about this. They don't talk about what it's like to see patterns before they emerge, to feel things before they're spoken, to hear the tremble in someone's voice, even when their words are calm. You don't want to notice it, you just do. And the longer you live like this, the harder it becomes to explain. Because how do you describe the burden of seeing what others refuse to? Carl Jung once said loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important. And if that line lands in your bones, you already know what this is. You see the cracks in relationships before they split, the burnout before the collapse, the lie hiding behind the polite smile, the longing behind the success story. And when you speak about it, people say you're too much, you think too deeply, you overanalyze everything. But the truth is, you're not overthinking, you're overfeeling, and you've been doing it for so long that silence feels safer than honesty. Because every time you speak the truth, you watch people flinch. They weren't ready for it, they didn't ask for it. And so eventually you stop offering it. This is the part no one tells you about intelligence, especially emotional or spiritual intelligence. That it's not just about what you know, it's about what you feel. And that knowing, that feeling, that awareness, it separates you. Not because you're better, because you're tuned to a different frequency. And that frequency comes with a cost. Statistically, individuals in the top 2% of intelligence distribution are 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from anxiety, depression, and social withdrawal. Not because they're unstable, but because they're constantly processing what others don't even register. Their nervous systems are flooded, their minds never rest. Their hearts carry what others won't touch. But you wouldn't know it by looking at them. They blend in, they laugh at the right times, they master the art of hiding in plain sight. Until one day they can't. Until the weight becomes too heavy to carry alone. And here's where the real question begins. Not what's wrong with me, but what am I supposed to do with this? Because you've tried softening your words. You've tried making yourself smaller. You've tried agreeing when your whole body wanted to speak the truth. And still, the ache didn't go away. So maybe the ache isn't a problem. Maybe it's a signal. So maybe it's your soul telling you that you were never meant to stay in the shallow end. Carl Jung didn't study behavior to make people normal. He studied the soul to help people become whole. He knew that what makes us different, our depth, our darkness, our vision, isn't a malfunction, it's a calling. But before you can rise into that truth, you have to go down into the parts of yourself you've ignored, into the voices you've silenced, into the figures inside you that have shaped your relationships, your longings, your fears, and that hold the key to everything you've struggled to understand. The ones Jung called the Anima and the Animus. And they've been waiting for you. What if the war isn't out there at all? What if the conflict is inside and wearing your face? And Carl Jung believed we each carry a hidden figure within us, a secret companion formed not by choice but by nature. For men, it's the anima, the unconscious feminine. For women, it's the animus, the unconscious masculine. But these aren't just gendered traits. They are archetypal energies, alive, complex, often buried so deep that we don't see them until they sabotage our lives. You felt this. That sudden obsession with someone you barely know. That unexplained irritation with someone who reminds you of something you can't name. That moment where you act completely out of character, driven by a voice you can't trace. That's them, the inner other. The anima in a man might emerge as mood swings, inexplicable longings, or intense romantic projections. The animus in a woman might appear as constant inner criticism, intellectual rigidity, or emotional detachment. And the more unaware you are of them, the more chaos they create. Jung didn't romanticize these forces. He warned of their power. He called them dangerous, especially when ignored. They possess a fatality, he wrote, that can on occasion produce tragic results. And if you're someone who sees deeply, who feels intensely, who notices what others miss, these inner figures become even more active. Because your outer clarity stirs the shadows within. And what you refuse to confront inside, you will chase or fight outside. You'll fall in love with the fantasy of someone who mirrors your unlived self. You'll battle with partners not for what they've done, but for what they trigger in you. You'll swing between longing and withdrawal, between needing too much and trusting too little. Marie-Louise von Franz, Jung's closest collaborator, said it simply. The animus fosters loneliness in women, while the anima thrusts men headlong into relationships and the confusion that accompanies them. This isn't theory. This is your history. Think back. How many times have you been overwhelmed by an emotional tide you couldn't explain? How many arguments weren't really about the person in front of you, but about something older, deeper, unnamed? This is why Jung's work matters now more than ever. Because we're not just battling society or systems or even relationships. We're battling ourselves. Until we recognize that the enemy is often a part of us, one we haven't yet listened to, we'll keep repeating the same painful loops. But here's the shift. Once you see the anima or animus, not as a flaw, but as a guide, everything begins to change. You stop blaming. You start integrating. You begin to reclaim the parts of yourself you projected onto others. And it's not a clean process. Honestly, it's messy, emotional, disorienting. Because it asks you to sit with the mirror, not the one on the wall, but the one inside. The mirror that shows you who you were pretending not to be, the parts you disowned, the voices you muted, the chaos you feared. But as you sit, something else begins to happen. The projections fade, the panic softens, the craving for someone else to fix you dissolves. Because now you're not waiting to be saved. You're building a bridge between who you've been and who you're becoming. And the person who walks across that bridge, they don't carry the same kind of burden because they've stopped running from it. They've turned around, faced it, listened, and in doing so, they've begun to lead. Some people carry their burden in silence. You did, others carry it in prophecy. Cassandra did both. The gods gave her the gift of foresight. She could see the future with razor clarity. But when she refused the god Apollo, he cursed her. Not by taking away her sight, but by making sure no one would ever believe her. She would speak the truth. She would warn of catastrophe. She would cry out as the Trojans opened their gates to the wooden horse. And no one would listen. She wasn't wrong. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't unstable. She was simply unseen. There's a reason her story still echoes across time. Because Cassandra wasn't just a myth, she was a mirror. How many times have you known before it happened? How many times have you said, "This doesn't feel right," only to be brushed aside? How many times have you been told, "You're too much, you worry too much, you think too much," only to watch what you warned about unfold? You didn't want to be right, you just wanted to be heard. But the world is allergic to truth that arrives early. Most people don't want to see until it's too late. And those who do, those who see first, feel first, speak first, are often cast as unstable, as inconvenient, as overreacting. But what if you weren't overreacting? What if you were just awake in a room full of people still dreaming? Carl Jung knew this weight well. A man who knows more than others becomes lonely, he wrote, because awareness doesn't just illuminate, it separates. It creates a distance between what you know and what you can say. And in that space, doubt creeps in. Maybe you start to wonder if you really are too much. Maybe you stop trusting your own clarity. Maybe you begin to shrink, not because you've lost your vision, but because you've learned that truth costs. And in a world obsessed with ease, truth becomes expensive. But here's the danger. The more often you're ignored, the more tempting it becomes to stop speaking, to silence yourself before someone else does. You learn to read the room before you read your own soul. You start censoring what you see, just to stay close to people who only love your quiet version. This is the quiet death of a scene, not because their vision failed, but because they stop offering. Because the silence is less painful than being dismissed. But that silence comes at a cost. There's a moment, a threshold, where you feel it. That if you hide your truth one more time, you might never find your way back to it. But the more you dilute yourself for others, the more you disappear. That the person they like isn't even you. And that's where the fork appears. Speak and risk exile, or stay silent and lose yourself. It's a brutal choice, but it's not a new one, because there was another story, another soul who faced that exact decision. Not a prophetess this time, a king, a wise one. And what he chose says everything about what it means to see clearly in a world that does not mean. Let me tell you about him. So, because in his story, you might recognize your own. Chapter 4: The Wise King and the Poisoned Well. There was once a king known not for his armies, but for his clarity. He ruled a city where reason prevailed. Justice was real. People felt seen. He listened more than he spoke. He wasn't perfect, but he was wise. And his wisdom held the kingdom together until one night. While the city slept, a witch came quietly and poured a potion into the town's only well. By dawn, everyone had drunk from it, everyone except the king. And by midday, the kingdom had gone mad. They spoke in riddle. They accused each other of crimes never committed. They forgot what day it was. They feared things that didn't exist. They praised things that had no meaning. And yet, to each other, they all seemed fine. It was the king who now seemed strange, distant, different. And when he tried to speak reason, when he warned of what was happening, they didn't listen. They looked at him with suspicion. They whispered behind closed doors. They called him unwell. By nightfall, they were ready to remove him, not because he'd failed, but because he'd stayed sane. So the king stood alone in his chamber, holding a goblet of water drawn from the same well, and he faced a choice: drink and be accepted, or refuse and be exiled. And that night he drank. The next morning the city rejoiced. Our king is one of us again, they said. He understands, but he didn't. He just gave up trying to be understood. And so the madness continued, polite, structured, celebrated. This story isn't about kings and wells. It's about now. It's about you. Because if you've ever hidden your insight just to be accepted, if you've ever laughed at the wrong jokes just to avoid standing out, if you've ever nodded along when everything in you screamed no, then you've tasted from the well. And maybe you didn't even realize it. Maybe you've been sipping for years, slowly letting go of the parts of you that saw too much, felt too deeply, spoke too early. Maybe you've adjusted your truth so well that it now fits comfortably into conversations that used to feel unbearable, but underneath the comfort is grief, kind of grief that only comes from abandoning the truth to keep the peace. Carl Jung warned about this. He said the greatest danger isn't in being wrong, it's in losing yourself inside the collective, in trading your clarity for applause, in giving up your mind so you don't lose your tribe. He knew that individuation, the becoming of your full self, requires solitude. It demands that you step out of the current, even when it carries everyone you love. It asks you to face the ache of being different, the silence of walking alone, the fear of never being understood. But he also left us something else, a thread of hope. He wrote, no matter how isolated you are, if you do your work truthfully and conscientiously, unknown friends will come and seek you. Unknown friends, not saviors, not crowds, just people, real ones, who don't flinch at your truth, who don't ask you to shrink, who don't confuse your clarity for coldness or your depth for drama. But you won't find them if you keep drinking. You won't find them if you keep pretending. You find them by standing in your truth, even when it costs you the room. You find them by staying clear while the world celebrates confusion. You find them by choosing to speak, not because it's safe, but because it's real. And maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you're still holding the goblet, still weighing the cost. That's okay. But know this, every time you choose to see and stay silent, a part of you goes quiet too. And every time you speak, even if your voice shakes, even if no one listens, you keep something alive, something rare, something sacred. The part of you that was born not to conform, but to wake the sleeping. Chapter 5, The Quiet Cost of Clarity. Not all burdens are loud. Some sit silently on your chest in the middle of a conversation, smiling while you feel the weight of everything left unsaid. Some don't scream, they hum quietly just beneath the noise of daily life. And that's the strange thing about being the one who sees too much. It's not always the seeing that's painful. It's the pretending not to. You've likely done it without realizing. You're at dinner. Someone says something off. The energy shifts. You feel the tension before anyone else does. You catch the glance, the micro expression, the subtle withdrawal. You know something just happened, but no one else seems to notice. So you stay quiet. You don't want to be that person again. You know how it ends. They tell you you're overreacting. They say, you're reading too much into it. You start to doubt yourself, not because you're wrong, but because you're tired. Tired of being the only one who names the invisible. And so you edit. You withhold. You smile more. You simplify your thoughts so they can land without resistance. You become fluent in small talk, even if it empties you. You hold back not because you lack words, but because you've learned what truth costs in a room that doesn't want it. Psychologists call it masking. Others call it fawning. Jung might have called it soul loss. Whatever you name it, the result is the same. You begin to disappear, and no one notices. Because the version of you they see still functions, still shows up, still says all the right things, but the real you, the full you, is miles beneath the surface, unspoken, undervalued, unreachable. This is the quiet cost of clarity, not the suffering that comes from misunderstanding, but the erosion that happens from constantly understanding everyone else and never being understood in return. And eventually, it starts to feel normal that you're the one who adjusts, that you're the one who carries the emotional labor, that you're the one who absorbs the discomfort so the room can stay light. But here's the dangerous part: you get good at it. So good, in fact, that even you forget how much you've buried. Until one day it catches up. It might be in the form of burnout or a sudden wave of grief that makes no sense, or the realization that you've surrounded yourself with people who like you more for your silence than your truth. And that's when the reckoning begins. The real work of individuation, as Jung called it, isn't just about discovering who you are, it's about unlearning who you became to survive. It's not just about waking up. It's about coming back to the parts of you that once spoke freely, back to the insights you used to share before they were dismissed, back to the little intuitions you used to follow before the world taught you to mistrust them. But that return isn't easy. Because the moment you start reclaiming your clarity, you begin losing your camouflage. You become visible again, not as the agreeable version, but as the real one. And that's where the loneliness spikes again, because some of the people closest to you may have never met the version of you that's now resurfacing. And some of them won't want to, but don't let that stop you, because the life you want, the connections you crave, the freedom you deserve, they only live on the other side of pretending. And there's something else that happens when you stop hiding. The weight doesn't go away, but it starts to shift. It's no longer a secret. It's no longer shame. It becomes something else, something useful, something holy. The burden begins to glow. Chapter 6. When the burden becomes a beacon, it happens so slowly you barely notice. One day you're carrying the weight of your insight like a curse. The next, you're offering it like a lantern. Not because the world suddenly got easier, but because you did. Because you stopped treating your perception like a problem, because you stopped apologizing for your depth, because you realized that your sensitivity wasn't a flaw, it was a compass, that your inner noise wasn't chaos, it was guidance, that the very things you tried to suppress were the exact things someone else was praying to find. Carl Jung called this individuation, the integration of the whole self, not the self you curated, not the self you compromised into acceptability, the real self, the full self, the sacred contradiction of soul and shadow, logic and feeling, chaos and clarity, held together by courage. And that courage doesn't look like dominance. It looks like stillness. It looks like choosing to speak even when your voice trembles. It looks like staying rooted when others ask you to bend. It looks like telling the truth, not to be right, but to be real. And something happens when you do. People begin to appear, not crowds, not noise, but kindred spirits, quiet ones, observant ones, people who see you, not just the mask, but the light behind your eyes. People who've walked through their own version of the fire and recognized the burn marks on yours. They won't need you to explain, they'll already know. And for the first time in a long time, you'll feel it, that click, that resonance, that quiet yes, the sense that you don't have to dilute anything to belong, that your voice isn't too much. that your vision isn't too strange, that your burden isn't yours alone anymore, because now it's a bridge, a beacon, something that doesn't just carry you forward, but calls others in. And maybe that's why you carried it for so long. Not because you were meant to suffer, but because you were meant to lead. Not with answers, but with presence. Not with perfection, but with depth. The world doesn't need more people who fit in. It needs people who can see, who can feel, who can hold the complexity and still move with love. It needs you. So if this found you at the right time, let it be a sign. Say something, even if it's just one word. Drop it in the comments. Say awake, not for the algorithm, for someone else who might be scrolling in silence, waiting for proof that they're not crazy, that they're not broken, that they're not alone in being alone. And if you've forgotten how much your light matters, let this remind you. It was never just a burden. It was never just weight. It was always the beginning of your light.